Hello, my name is Josh Altic. I'm the Director of Research at Ballotpedia, and here today I have Julie Schmidt speaking with me, and we're going to discuss private school choice and her experience with it. And thank you so much for joining us, Julie.
I'm happy to be here. I love talking about school, anything related to it. So, school choice is not my favorite, but I definitely have some experience there.
Great. Well, can you start just by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
So, I am a school board member at Claremont Northeastern Schools. We are located east of Cincinnati. We are in Appalachia. We are one of the Appalachian counties. We have about 1,400 students, K through 12, but we're 75 square miles wide. I started my first year as a board member was 2020, so it was very trial by fire. I got elected in November of 2019 and started January 2020, and then we all know how that went beginning in March. So my first 4 years felt like about 8. I am currently in my 6th year. Not only do I serve locally, I serve with the Ohio School Board Association. I serve on our Southwest District executive team, and I'm a trustee and on the board member cabinet. So I stay pretty busy as far as how involved I am with education and advocacy for education.
Great. So when you discuss the idea of private school choice and the school choice policies that are being put around, both public and private, and you're discussing things with the parents in your district, the families in your district, what are you hearing at a high level? What are the concerns? What are the advantages? What are you hearing most when that topic is brought up?
So first of all, I think there's a lot of confusion. So when I say I'm anti-school choice, I'm not anti-school choice. What I'm anti is using public dollars to pay for that private education. So I am absolutely 100% in support of parents choosing whatever school works best for your child, because every child is individual, every child is unique, and every child needs different things. Some thrive in larger schools, some smaller, all girls, all boys, parochial education, all of those things. So I think that's the very first hurdle we kind of have to jump over when we're talking about it, especially in my area, is people feel hurt, like, well, I chose what was best for my child, and I'm just being a good mom, dad, grandparent, what have you. So my big issue, especially in Ohio, is we're coming from a background of having our educational system be declared unconstitutional, not once, but twice. And it's taken over 20 years to sort of fix that. In that process, we came up with a great plan. It's called the Free School Funding Plan. And there was a ton of research that went into it to find out exactly what it does take to educate a student. We haven't fully implemented that yet on our side, but yet we're starting to funnel a lot of money, and including in this budget, more money to private schools than public schools. But 85% of Ohio students are in public schools. So explaining that piece starts to get people to understand kind of what we're talking about and what the really big picture is. Because if you talk about school choice on a small level, it doesn't sound so bad, right? Okay, well, I get this money from the state to send my kid to, for example, Claremont Northeastern. Why wouldn't I take that same amount and be able to apply it somewhere else? The problem is it's also a lot higher dollar amount. So for our district, we get about $3,500 from the state, but someone who's going to go to a private school would get $7,000 per child. It's a big difference. And if we got $7,000 to educate each student from the state, we could do a whole lot of wonderful things besides what we're already doing. So explaining kind of how that works and just really getting them to understand. And then once they understand that we don't have an option. Our closest high school, parochial high school or private high school, is 45-minute drive. So not only do you have to get your student there and get them home, you have extracurriculars if they, want to be involved in any kind of sports or music, band, student senate, really anything. And then you're doing that. So it disadvantages a ton of families who don't have transportation. They don't have an extra car. They can't afford an extra car, all of those types of things. So we really just don't have that option.
Yeah, we've been looking a lot at the trends here, and especially in red states, Republican-led states, there's a lot of traction behind the idea of education savings accounts or doing that, funneling public funds to private education. And one of the big flexion points that we're noticing is the conversation about how those policies affect students who aren't in the big urban areas. So rural students or people who are, like you said, have that issue of access to private schools. So let's get into a little more granular there. I suppose you've heard from parents and families on sort of both sides about wanting the option, but also being worried about the availability. So what do you think, from a solutions perspective, what do you think are the best ideas you've seen to accomplishing the idea or the point of these policies in those rural areas? Is there any place for this kind of idea, or is it largely outside of the ability for the area and the infrastructure to support that kind of policy?
So honestly, at the core of it, the reason they want these ESAs, or the reason they want this choice, is because they say our schools are failing. But yet, like I mentioned before, our schools haven't been properly funded for 20 years. And even in this Fair School Funding Plan, we're only in year 3. And they're putting in certain pieces of it, but not others. So our dollar amounts are still from 2021 or 2022. We know 2025 looks a lot different than 2022 as far as costs go. So we're constantly behind the finish line here, because we can't ever get what it actually costs to educate a student before they're funneling money out. And I truly believe if we actually funded the schools, our public schools, where 85% of our kids go, and gave us the ability to really use those dollars to support our communities the way we know how, because no one knows our communities like we do, right? Our school district is the hub of our community. We don't have a town. So a lot of rural districts might have a small town. We don't have that. We're 75 square miles. We do have a few rural towns, but nothing that is like a thriving, small town type of an area. We do have very large farmland. We have a ton of profitable farms, which really affects our state funding. You would think we're a very rural district. We might get more state funding. But the value of our farmland makes our property seem about $100,000, the median, $100,000 over what it actually is. So we're getting funded well below where we should be. Now, that's one reason that some people say, well, then the Fair School Funding Program doesn't work for everybody. But it works for most people. And we won't know until we get it fully implemented, the school's fully funded, and then we can look at the outliers like our district and say, why isn't this working for them specifically? Because right now we're on what's called a guarantee, which means we haven't received any less money than we did in 2020. But we're also, if we have property tax increases, we're not seeing that in our district. We're not seeing those things. We are already on the floor. So we're not seeing increased revenue where we are. And our local taxpayers are paying almost 60% of what it takes to educate a student. That's through both property taxes, and we passed a 1% income tax in 1995. That's the last levy we ever passed. So between the 1% income tax and the property tax, that's the only way that we're really functioning as a district. Whereas a lot of other districts, you'll have, it's the opposite. They're getting 70 from the state and their local is 30. So we don't even have a local tax base that we can say, hey, we really need new buildings because they're extremely old, because they're already contributing to 60% of what it costs just to function. And that's outside of any bond issues or anything like that. And I get it. Like the taxing, that's a big deal, right? Your taxes go up. But as far as like supporting the infrastructure of having a private school, it's not accessible to rural communities. They're not coming to rural communities. There's not a huge, I think, appetite for it in rural communities. And it's simply not feasible. We already have the requirement in Ohio to transport students to parochial schools and to private schools if they're in our district, as long as it's within 30 minutes. So we're taking on that transportation expense already. And even there's, quite a few that it's just not feasible for us to do it, to send, 3 kids on a bus for 30 minutes each way. So there's a lot of pieces that I think if we relied more on our local communities, the community school model, I think, is a very successful model and way to get your community buy-in for schools. I know there's several very large city districts that have done it well, Columbus City, Cincinnati Public, but it's working in rural communities too and providing additional services at your school that aren't available other places.
Can you remind our listeners where Ohio is at with its private school choice program, just to so we sort of have that context, how much it's being used, how old it is. We just talked to some people in Tennessee, and they're just looking sort of down the barrel, right? It's just it's got passed. So how long has it been a factor in your district, and how have you seen it affect either attendance or anything concrete? I know you've talked a lot about the funding issues, and I really get that, but anything else in your district with regard to attendance, or like you said, those transportation costs, administrative costs, anything like that where you've seen a concrete effect because of what's happening on the private side?
So there's several pieces. So the other piece about private is they can decide who they want to take and who they don't want to take, right? So you could have a student who wants to go to that school, and maybe they do go for a year and then they're kicked out because of academics or behavior, or they have special needs that the school can't accommodate. Well, then guess what? Who has to take that on? That's our local rural districts. So we've seen a decline in our overall enrollment. I think that's related to two things. One thing Ohio has is open enrollment. So a district can have open enrollment and you can just go to whatever school you want to, as long as, again, they're not at capacity. So we have lost some to open enrollment. Online school, that's really the charter school piece. That's really the option that we see more. But we are also losing, especially at the elementary level. We do have one. We have one in our district, and then we have several outside of our district that are pretty close, parochial elementaries, where Cincinnati is a very Catholic area. So there are a lot of parochial schools. So the class sizes are much smaller there. I think our local one, there's about 8 students per class. So that's a big difference. Even though we keep ours pretty low, about 25 or less, we're definitely seeing that. Ohio has had school choice. Oh my goodness. So we started out with something that I don't necessarily disagree with, but it started in Cleveland. There was a financial based system where they were having schools, they weren't succeeding, and they were giving certain parents of a certain income a voucher to use at different schools. And then we increased that in the last, I want to say 5 or 6 years, might be a little more. And we've generally increased that. And then in the last 2 years, they made it so that it was anybody, any income. There are no income restrictions. So it doesn't matter if you make $150,000 a year, $200,000 a year, you still get a portion of that money to go to a school. And so we have gone from what started as, trying to help some city students get a better option to continually having what I think is private investments into education and for-profit schools. If the audience knows about ECOT, that was Ohio, and that was millions and millions and millions of dollars for a charter school that just went out the window, that we were paying for no one in schools, and Ferraris and expensive cars for administrators and trips and just all kinds of crazy things. So that was something we dealt with. So we have been on this road a long time. And every time I see it come up in a different state, Kentucky, Tennessee, I am just screaming from the rooftops to anyone I know there that you do not want this, because once it starts, there's really no end. It just is different ways of how can we expand it. And that's what we're seeing to this point in our budget, which we won't officially have until June 1st. But we're seeing that there's more money going into the private school vouchers with no income restriction. And the data shows that it's not new students going in. The data shows that it is current students taking advantage of it. And then we're also seeing an increase in tuition on those same exact numbers. So we're not really doing what we say that we're doing. The only thing we're doing really is taking that funding from everyone else.
One of the things we're paying attention to is how how different the policies are from state to state, and especially in a very rural states, one of the one of the hurdles, one of the main arguments that's sort of preventing these policies from going into effect, and that's making it a split policy issue on the Republican side, is the idea of the impact on rural districts and rural communities. And so
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing a lot of different sort of provisions being put in to assuage those concerns specifically. And I think what we've heard is that rural legislators actually feel like they have a voice in this area. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess putting on that, I understand that for you it's a very sad perspective of this is a little bit inevitable, right? It's kind of
Right. Yeah.
happened already. So let's assume for a moment that it's hard to roll back and that it's going forward. What types of policies would you think would have the biggest assuaging effect, the biggest effect on helping the rural school districts and the rural communities actually take advantage of it? And I'll give you some examples. We've seen everything from, hold harmless type provisions where you freeze funding for school districts so that it doesn't go down, that the per pupil funding doesn't go down based on people unenrolling. So that's one. The other ones we've seen, compensation increases for public school teachers, a one-time bonus, that kind of thing. We've also seen in North Dakota, the recent debate was that the governor vetoed an expansion, and the governor wanted to actually make funds available to all students. So there would be a larger fund available to private school students, but there would also be a significant amount of money available to public school students to provide for tutoring or other educational expenses. So that's one thing we've seen. We've seen prohibitions on legislators' students using the voucher and stuff like that. So I guess, have you seen any policy details that you would just love to see added to the policy in Ohio, or that you would advocate for in other states, saying if you're going to do this, make sure you include this so that your rural communities are protected and have some kind of benefit?
So the biggest thing that I can think of would just be the access piece for rural, and that would be including some sort of a transportation provision so that if they do take the voucher and they are, more than a half an hour away, that private school needs to figure out how to get those students, whether that's a minibus or whatever, or they create some kind of plan or there's a transportation reimbursement for those families. We can't take public transportation either. Like that's not a thing for us, right? So we can't take public transportation. We can't do those things. So I think trying to get that access piece, literally getting the kids to the buildings or having some feature for them to get to the buildings is my best case scenario. I will say, when you mentioned the North Dakota piece, having those additional funds available for rural students to take advantage of is great. But I don't know that many rural families, they're really looking for that private education either. It's not necessarily that they're not happy with their public schools or anything like that. It's their community. And a lot of times, like I mentioned, in our district, the school is the hub of the community. And so when you leave that, you're kind of leaving your community, and that doesn't really speak to rural folks. I went to more of a suburban school. My husband is from this area, so this was a very brand new learning process for me to kind of understand our overall community. I've been here 11 years now, but it really is about taking care of each other and being in places and seeing each other, whether it's in church on Sunday, or it's at the Friday night football game, or it's at the band and choir assembly. You're constantly seeing your friends and neighbors and catching up. And so I don't really even think that there is a demand in the rural areas for, I want access to a private school, because they don't necessarily think that it's any better. They graduated from public schools. Their parents graduated from public schools. There's, some kids are going to college. Some are going into tech. Some are going into agriculture. Some are going right into the workforce. We just had graduation last night. So, there's celebrating so many different things, a lot of military families. So it's not even really, I think, an appeal to them to bring that there or to give that access. And that's not speaking for everybody, but I would say that's speaking to, the wide majority, is that they're not even looking at it because they don't even see it as like this big thing that is missing for them.
Right. One of the things, well, help us explain how these two concerns fit in, because we've heard, it seems like the strongest arguments for how these programs don't hurt and don't help and might even hurt rural school districts, it kind of fall in two areas. There's one, the argument of access, the idea that that's not useful. There's no demand for it. They don't want it, and they can't use it. Right. That's a big right. argument. On the other side, there's the argument, well, these students are going to use these private school vouchers and are going to leave the public schools. They're going to, enrollment's going to drop. The people who are left in the public schools are going to be people who aren't accepted by the private schools, because there's that discrimination aspect to it. So between those two, I think a lot of our readers and sometimes our audience have trouble reconciling those two. Because it seems like in any given district, now you've talked a lot about the funding issue, and that is an important issue that isn't quite addressed here. But you wonder, well, is it going to hurt the districts because a lot of students use the funding, or is it that they can't use it because there's no access? They seem incompatible. So how do you kind of reconcile those, and how are you thinking about that? And what have you heard from your constituents about access versus harm?
So for us, I mean, I doubt where you're coming from, but I think we're listening to the wrong people who are advocating for those things. You don't have a ton of rural people saying, oh, we're going to lose all the kids to these private districts. The reason we would lose the kids to the private districts is if, again, we don't fund our public schools properly, and we're not giving them the same tools to provide the same type of education. And so what we're looking at in Ohio is really the long term. Seems like they just are not interested in public education. I mean, honestly, that's the direction we're going. We've kind of dismantled our state board of education. We've changed that. We've changed a lot of things. So we're on that kind of trajectory. So the one thing about us having experience in this for so long, whereas you said like Tennessee is brand new in it, and Kentucky said absolutely not, which was amazing. I was so proud of them. We're so far down that I think we've seen the families that are going to leave have already left. And we're not seeing those big numbers. We're not seeing a huge shift to private schools. We're not, even in the last 5 years, even in the last 3 years where it was expanded, we're not seeing that at all. All we're seeing is now that we're providing that, because the money has to come from somewhere, right? So it's in a different spot, it's in a different location, but it's still going to education. And when we look at it as a whole, and you see this money is going here, but it's really only helping 15% of our students, how is that really equitable? And is that in our, what our state constitution says? There is a lawsuit called Vouchers. It's Vouchers Against Ohio is who started it. We joined in the early on stages, and now there's more and more districts, but really fighting even the constitutionality of vouchers and the way that they're doing it. But I don't think we're ever going to see a ton of loss of students in rural areas. What we're going to see is less and less funding to support those students. And so then we're going to see schools close, schools get smaller. For example, my district, if we didn't have that 1% income tax, we wouldn't survive. Our district would have been broken up into, I think we touched six districts. We would have probably been broken up and into all of those because we never could sustain it. But we're on a piece where luckily we had that 20 years ago, but never did we see that our funding would change as drastically as it has.